So I'm really happy to be back here. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you to all the organizers of this conference. Thank you to all the scholars whose labor and the research shaped the concept behind this symposium. I'm really honored to be here. I was telling some folks that I'll use any excuse to get back to Michigan. And the last time I was in this room, I was doing my master's thesis defense. And it thankfully was a great experience. So I think that bodes well for today. So the title of my talk is slightly different than what's listed here. The title of my talk has since changed, and the title is now Repositories of Failure, Constructing Abolitionist Archives to Project Past the Punishment Paradigm. So I'll get right into it. Archivists obsess over obsolescence. Abstractly, if one accepts that the English word obsolete originates from the Latin word meaning to fall into disuse and be forgotten about, then one might see archives as an exercise in mitigating or managing the obsolescence of people, places, and ideas. In addition to the standard processes of archives, such as appraisal and description, archivists engage in a series of subsequent actions. They digitize collections, curate exhibits, for example, that encourage the public to use archival records in their custody so that particular narratives escape obsolescence. Concretely, archivists express this obsession in response to the growing concerns for the technological obsolescences of software applications and the requisite hardware to ensure long-term preservation and access of foreign digital files, which should be stated as sort of my day-to-day job at Princeton as a digital archivist. Evidence of this obsession exists in the pages of professional literature on the subject of digital forensics, as well as the establishment of an interinstitutional and international collaborative consortium that offers solutions and services for archivists to ameliorate, if not avoid, the impacts wrought by obsolescence. Obsolescence, then, is deeply embedded in the past, present, and future of archives. The feminist scholar Angela White Davis shares an obsession with obsolescence, albeit in a radically different context and with a radically different conclusion. She posits in her book, Are Prisons Obsolete, that, quote, many people have already reached a conclusion that the death penalty is an outmoded form of punishment that violates the basic principles of human rights. It is time, I believe, to encourage similar conversation about the prison. The question of whether the prison has become an obsolete institution has become especially urgent in light of the fact that more than 2 million people out of a world total of 9 million now inhabit U.S. prisons, jails, youth facilities, and immigrant detention centers, end quote. So whereas archivists engage obsolescence as a warning, Davis engages obsolescence as a welcome. For Davis, the obsolescence of the prison, which is the anchor of the American punishment paradigm, beckons justice advocates to consider the prison's abolition and not just its amendment. Moreover, Davis couches her claims for prison abolition with the caveat that no single system can serve as a substitute. Instead, prison abolition must be accompanied by the construction of a constellation of alternatives, including emergent institutions that will subsume the social and physical landscapes currently occupied by prisons. Accordingly, Davis asserts the centrality of education to this goal by stating that, quote, schools can therefore be seen as the most powerful alternative to jails and prisons. This paper builds on the writings of Davis and other theorists to argue that abolitionist archives constitute a critical component to the constellation of alternatives to imagine a societal landscape free from our present punishment paradigm. It will begin by characterizing the scope and the origins of the punishment paradigm in the United States, as well as its lasting linkages between prisons and police. Next, the paper will analyze contemporary narratives of police violence to amplify the avenue to the paradigm's persistence. Finally, this paper will conclude by exploring how abolitionist archives might come into formation and assist in the sustenance of a society that relies on new sets of relationships to promote justice and reduce violence. To uproot a system deeply entrenched within a country's societal and political fabric requires, among other things, an accurate identification of the system and an honest account of its origins. Thus, envisioning the end to the punishment paradigm must start with the definition of its scope as well as a grasp of its genesis. Rather than offer comprehensive coverage on these matters today, this section of the paper will provide a concise but workable understanding of the punishment paradigm to allow the paper's following sections to give voice to the issue from the perspectives of those most directly impacted and to imagine the paradigm's undoing vis-a-vis archives. So, what is the punishment paradigm? The punishment paradigm might be characterized as a perspective and an administration of justice that responds to social discords, disruptions, and disturbances by authorizing armed agents of the state to enact arbitrary amounts of violence, including but not limited to incarceration, surveillance, and forced labor. To enact arbitrary amounts of violence upon those peoples in a society deemed to be its deserving delinquents. And just as a pause, I have a footnote here that I obviously can't read in the context of the paper, but the way that I'm defining delinquents is Michel Foucault's book, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. So, more than a mere view of justice, the punishment paradigm entails an active administration of violence that agents are authorized to exact in traditional sites of punishment, such as prisons, jails, such as local jails, state and federal prisons, as well as non-traditional sites of punishment, such as schools, psychiatric hospitals, libraries, and increasingly airports. The variety of venues in which state agents exact this violence demonstrate that its authors are found not only in the obvious roles of police or correctional officer, but also in more conspicuous roles of school resource officers, doctors, librarians, and customs agents. The irrational and inconsistent logic of the punishment paradigm posits that control and capitalization of incorrigible bodies supersede any concerns for actual safety and security, as safety and security are pro forma considerations for a paradigm empowered for the prima facie purpose to encumber and enslave indiscriminately. So, where did this punishment paradigm start? The origins of this peculiarly American punishment paradigm extend before the experiment of the United States existed. Scott Christensen notes that, quote, colonial America had more jails than public hospitals or schools. In 1657, the General Assembly made the counties in Virginia, the General Assembly made the counties liable for damages for any inmate who escaped for, quote, want of a sufficient prison, end quote. While much of the rhetoric following the Revolutionary War rejected executive tyranny at the still-forming federal level, Mark E. Kahn asserts that the nascent nation encouraged such tyranny at local levels to mitigate the problem that, quote, too much liberty was fatal to citizens, and patriarchal political power was needed to defend citizens and their liberty, end quote. A particular concern to the newly elected lovers of liberty in the late 18th century were the existential threats that designated delinquents posed to the order of dictatorship disguised as democracy. In examining the establishment of jails and almshouses in early Philadelphia, Simon P. Newman and Billy G. Smith explained that, quote, it was only in the later 18th century that civic authorities in American cities began to regard symptoms of poverty as evidence of personal moral degeneracy and criminality rather than as a result of larger social circumstances. The rising number of impoverished immigrants from Europe, especially Ireland, as well as of black migrants, contributed to an increasing sense that a rapidly growing class of masterless men and women threatened proper social order and the good Republican government. In the 1780s and 1790s, the term vagrancy evolved to describe a host of disorderly people, including not only to the wandering poor, but also Indians, ex-slaves, apprentices, protesters, prostitutes, political radicals, the lower classes in general, a few pesky Canadians, and of course, the Irish, end quote. Few pesky Canadians is those authors' terms. No offense to any Canadians in the room. We love you, we may be joining you very soon. Kahn corroborates this claim when he states, quote, punishment was palatable to liberal society because it was applied disproportionately to marginal Americans, male youths, poor people, recent immigrants, and black males, as well as fallen women, who lacked the wherewithal to challenge patriarchal political power, end quote. Thus, the punishment paradigm in America germinates from a societal and political contract to control and coerce black, poor, feminine, and immigrant bodies. Only after recognizing the primary purpose of the punishment paradigm can one trace its path. With the birth of a new nation, that path deviated from the methods of punishment perfected in Western Europe and imported to colonial America. These methods range to include everything from banishment and branding to torture and executions. Moreover, the public presentation of punishment underscored its intent to foment fear into potential lawbreakers. But a new republic ushered in a new method to prescribe punishment: science in secret. Rather than assemble a public crowd for the state to punish different types of crimes with the same blunt acts of violence, Republican reformers in the 1790s argued successfully to proportion punishments relative to the crime committed and to exact this violence behind, quote, imposing walls of new institutions. Prior to this pivot in philosophy during the late 18th century, incarceration in and of itself rarely constituted punishment. Again, I want to reiterate that. Prior to this pivot in philosophy during the late 18th century, incarceration in and of itself rarely constituted punishment. Instead, incarceration confined persons until judges sentence them or enforcers administer the sentence, be it via the whip, the rope, or the stocks, among other options. But prominent physicians, most notably Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia, viewed punishment as a science that states could calculate and administer like drugs to sick patients. So in time became the prescription that penal reformers advocated for most vociferously, and authorities proportioned time out to prisoners based on the offender's background and crime. Their collective rationale, albeit disingenuous, argued that prolonged separation from family, community, and society provided the safest and swiftest means through which to return healthy citizens back into the world. But this rationale fails to explain the conspicuous rise of the early 19th century pro-prison movement and alongside anti-slavery campaigns in northern states such as New York and Pennsylvania. In fact, Thomas Eddy, who was the first director of Newgate Prison in New York, also lobbied for the state's 1817 graduate emancipation law. So whereas Pennsylvania reformers continued to emphasize rehabilitation through solitary confinement and penitence, the New York prison administration style that emerged in the early 1800s at the state's prison in Auburn emphasized strict inmate obedience, complete silence, and forced labor. This mode of prison administration, the Auburn system, influenced the direction of the state's Sing Sing maximum security prison itself, which was constructed with labor of Auburn's prisoners in 1826. Because of its focus on forced labor, within a few years after its establishment, Sing Sing became the first prison in the United States to produce a profit rather than incur debt. Sing Sing officials, according to the religion scholar Jennifer Graber, quote, recognized only two goals: prison order and prison profit were now the state's highest interests. Inmate reformation, they argued, was neither possible nor an appropriate goal for this state to pursue, end quote. The Auburn system of prison administration gained the most currency, literally and figuratively, with anti-slavery and pro-prison activists elsewhere in the United States, and it dominated the direction of further prison construction across the country. The apparent contradiction between advocating freedom for slaves but advocating incarceration for convicts is reconciled with the reality that enslavement itself was a form of incarceration, and likewise, incarceration was a form of enslavement. In both instances, bodies were confined, controlled, and made to toil against their will under the threat of punishment. Resistance resulted in severe punishment, although in both spaces, slaves and inmates shared vital information used to plot escapes and increase their prospects of survival. As such, it is not the case that enslavement and incarceration suddenly converged after the Civil War, a common misconception due to the 13th Amendment's provision allowing slavery as punishment for convicted criminals. Rather, these two institutions began, developed, and grew alongside one another. The punishment paradigm holds, then, that incarceration is not a descendant of slavery, but in fact a surviving sibling. The right of individuals to control black bodies and capitalize from their forced labor, which was a pillar of Southern economy and society, evaporated, while the right of states to do the same, a pillar of Northern economy and society, elevated. The peculiarities of the American punishment paradigm leads Scott Christensen to conclude, quote, prisons are repositories of failure that remind us of problems which will prove unsettling if put in open view, end quote. But it is incumbent to recognize this failure's function and comprehend the very point of incarceration, which Michel Foucault asserts is not to eradicate violence and crime, but rather to, quote, distinguish them, to distribute them, or to use them, or to provide them with a general economy. A society can only actualize this utility of violence and crime if it is able to isolate them, surveil them, and transform them into a, quote, useful delinquency. A transformation, Foucault argues, is unthinkable without the development of police. It follows then that the project of the punishment paradigm is incomplete without the police, as the paradigm relies on the institution to exact its violence onto delinquents no longer or not yet in the grip of imprisonment. In the following section of this paper, those currently and recently impacted by that grip will offer testimony that explains the endurance of the punishment paradigm. And now is where I'll begin to talk a little bit about the project that you see here on your screen. First, I'm going to drink water before I pass out. Prisons and police are complementary purveyors of punishment. To silo discussion of one institution at the exclusion of the other obscures the intimate link between them, a link that also traces its roots back to enslavement. The root of incarceration stems back to control and capital, and so too does the root of policing, as evidenced through the words of a constable during antebellum Virginia. And I quote, "It was part of my business to arrest all slaves and free persons of color who were collected in crowds at night and lock them up. I am paid 50 cents for every Negro I arrest, and 50 cents more if I flog them. I have flogged hundreds. I am often employed by private persons to pursue fugitive slaves. I have been employed since 1833. I never refused a good job of that kind." End quote. This testimony and those that follow demonstrate that the punishment paradigm is systematically incapable of holding its most public-facing institution, police, accountable for abuses against society's designated delinquents. In fact, these abuses and subsequent absence of accountability serve to further entrench the paradigm's purpose. And the paradigm persists in part precisely because the institution of policing commits routine and spectacular acts of violence against... Oh, that's a conspiracy.
They're watching me, man.
Yeah.
No, they really are watching.
I don't know.
I can keep going though. I got it.
And while you're talking, I will put it back up.
Okay.
Too powerful.
This is not the first time this happened. When I was out of LA and I was giving a talk at the Community Archives Forum, that's the day that Twitter went down.
Yeah.
And we don't think that was by coincidence. Yeah, it really is. Okay. In fact, these abuses and subsequent absence of accountability serve to further entrench the paradigm's presence. And the paradigm persists in part precisely because the institution of policing commits routine and spectacular acts of violence against people living at the intersections of poverty, mental illness, and blackness. This phenomenon became especially apparent in northern cities towards the twilight of both the Civil Rights Movement and Vietnam War in the late 1960s, and the onset of the war on drugs in the early 1970s, as the punishment apparatus began to occupy the quotidian life of marginalized and poor communities. That occupation manifested itself uniquely in upper Midwestern cities, whose manufacturing jobs had once supplied steady employment for its black citizens, but were now battling the ripple effects of rapid deindustrialization. In one of those cities, Cleveland, Ohio, this mixture of social and economic circumstances gave rise to police departments that exacted violence in response to the slow erosion of social safety nets and welfare programs. It is within this context of the punishment paradigm that the community organization Puncture the Silence, Stop Mass Incarceration emerged in April 2014 as the Cleveland chapter of the national organization Stop Mass Incarceration, which was founded by Carl Dix and Cornel West. PTS, as its surname suggests, formed in response to a call issued by the legal scholar Michelle Alexander in her book, The New Jim Crow. But the group changed course shortly after its founding in response to the August 9, 2014 murder of Michael Brown Jr. by Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, a morph that reflects the inseparability of incarceration and policing. To that end, PTS organized a public tribunal the following spring and invited Cleveland residents to testify before a panel of advocates and professionals about their experiences with police brutality in the city, with the goal of submitting the event's documentation to the mayor's office and international human rights entities such as the United Nations and the Amnesty International. The testimonies given at this tribunal, which was titled The People's Tribunal on Police Brutality, provide first-hand narrations about encounters with the punishment paradigm and its lack of accountability within their lives and those of loved ones. For instance, Alvin Brooks described a vivid episode of brutality he suffered in the early 1970s at the 4th District Police Station. And I wanted to show you all the videos, but I came prepared, so I can just read out the text as best as I can. And so this is the testimony of Alvin Brooks. Quote, "The sergeant behind the desk grabbed the cuffs and snatched me over. And as soon as he did that, then the other ones pulled out the blackjacks and everything else and just get to commencing to just beat me even more. They ended up ripping my pants off while I was basically half naked in the police station. And after all this didn't happen, I'm really messed up. All of a sudden, one of the officers says, 'Look what we have here.' He had a joint. They end up lighting that joint up, passing it all around to one another, and the last one who took a puff put it out on my face. And they end up taking me back to the cell block. But even something that was more dramatic than that, like when they had me bent over the desk, one of the officers took a nightstick, and do I have to tell you what they tried to do? So, that sort of leadership, that policing, that's not police business. See, once I was handcuffed, I was never a threat in the first place. I did my little wiggling because they beat me, but as far as really getting, some smackdown, I wasn't into that. But, they really did some bodily harm and charged me for assaulting a police officer, charged me for marijuana, charged me for inciting a riot. This harrowing experience, Brooks stated, began as a dispute over a parking ticket in the city's popular Shaker Square area and concluded with his indictment. Art Blakey opened his testimony by stating his inability to recount the many times he's endured police violence, so Art instead testified on behalf of his slain sister, Kiana Nicole Blakey, and quote his testimony. And yeah, I could sit up and talk about all the abuses of police brutality that I've went through in my life and my family, but that would take much more than 5 minutes. So I'm going to just harp on one incident with my sister. Her name was Nicole, Kiana Nicole Blakey. She was killed on August 18th in 1989. And there was a cop, a Cleveland cop, who was at that point an off-duty cop, who was stalking my sister, wanting to meet her. But she was much younger than he was. She was only 19 years old. And we heard that, we got a phone call saying my sister attempted suicide. And she was found dead in the hallway of her apartment building, which was, Longwood Apartments. And we was trying to get more information, but we couldn't even get in contact with them on any part of the investigation or even get information about the body or anything else. We had to actually get a lawyer to actually have them release the body. And another autopsy report was done, and it was found that she was shot twice in the head, execution style. End quote. The city of Cleveland paid a multi-million-dollar settlement to the family of Kiana, who in the following week was scheduled to begin her college career at Ohio State University on a full scholarship. Testifiers at the tribunal reiterated that the financial payments offered to families could never restore the life taken from them, as Alicia Kirkman speaks about the life of her son killed on March 23rd, 2007. And her testimony begins, quote, "My name is Alicia Kirkman. My son was Angelo Miller. He got killed 8 years ago. It's hard for me to do this. It's been 8 years, but it seemed like the longer it is, the worse it's getting. He was 17 years old. He was out doing some things that kids do. We all have not did right growing up. So he broke in the car, so him and his friends got away. So Angelo comes back home. He gets his car thinking, he could go get the radio he stole out the car, but it didn't happen like that. When he was pulling up, it was an off-duty police officer. I really don't know how this went because I wasn't there. But what I do know is when they told me that my son tried to run the police officer over, every mother knows their child, the good and the bad. I knew my son didn't try to run a police officer over. So the guy on one tape came and you heard the one officer saying, "Put your hands up, put your hands up." You heard my baby saying, "My hands are up. I swear to God, I don't have nothing, ain't doing nothing." All of a sudden, the phone went dead. My son's car was shot up 8 times. It don't take a rocket scientist to figure out. If my son was trying to run him over, why was it the front windshield shot out? Why was it the back windshield shut out? All the shots came from the side of the car. A bullet went in, ricocheted, hit my son in the back. And I had a lawyer. A lawyer came for me. It's not about money. What's going to happen to this police officer? You know the 911 tape is letting you know my son said, my hands are up, I swear I ain't doing nothing, don't got nothing. But it's just a mystery. You hear your son saying his hands are up, but how did the car still move? You know if your child said, my hands are up, the car gotta be stopped, you know? But as usual with the city of Cleveland, what they do when they know they're wrong, they will settle. They will settle. Me, I don't want your money. You know, I want this police officer to be charged, end quote. These three narrations give voice to the multi-generational breakdown of accountability with police in the city. Moreover, they corroborate the findings of a 2-year investigation into the Cleveland Police Department conducted by the U.S. Department of Justice. The investigation concluded, and I quote, "We found incidents of Cleveland police officers firing their guns at people who do not pose an immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury to officers and others using guns in a careless and dangerous manner. At times, this force appears to have been applied as punishment for the person's earlier verbal or physical resistance to an officer's command, and is not based on a current threat posed by the person. Principal among the systemic deficiencies that have resulted in the pattern of practice we have found is the division's failure to implement effective and rigorous accountability systems. The absence of accountability in these instances highlights the functional malfunction in a punishment paradigm intent on its self-perpetuation. The paucity of accountability for excessive police violence serves to communicate to state agents that no amount of force is unjustifiable in the subjugation of poor, mentally ill, or black citizens, because the system can never harm those for whom it was never intended to protect. It is at this juncture of rationalization that the prison meets the police in the punishment paradigm, and the two unite to create what Foucault calls, quote, twin mechanism to secure the differentiation, isolation, and use of delinquency. The punishment paradigm's roots in racism and other forms of structural inequality, as well as its incapability of holding itself accountable, require a re-envisioning of justice and accountability that lay beyond the bounds of punishment. And the next section of this paper probes how abolitionist archives might help meet this end. This paper asserts that the punishment paradigm in the United States encompasses a perspective and an administration of justice that projects deliberately inconsistent levels of violence against poor, mentally ill, and immigrant bodies for the purposes of control and capital. This pursuit, I argue, outweighs legitimate concerns for safety and stems from a poisonous and racist root. As such, no amount of reformation can redeem or rescue an inherently rotten regime. That's the message for now. Thus, to explore the imagination beyond the punishment paradigm necessitates considering a world free of prisons and police, as well as their remnants that have penetrated schools, psychiatric hospitals, libraries, and airports. For archivists, the vision commands imagining our place within that process of liberation through the Abolitionist archive, which might be defined as explicitly freedom-focused and justice-driven memory work projects and networks whose long-term impacts would include the construction of a society in which all bodies and minds have an equal opportunity to be free of coercion, cages, and control of state and individual actors. The Abolitionist archive, then, is less concerned with destruction of existing institutions, which is a focus that would limit the range of alternatives. Rather, the Abolitionist archive is more concerned with construction of new spaces, what Michelle Caswell might characterize as, quote, an ongoing process of conceptualizing what we want the future to look like. Two aspects our abolitionist archives might center are reparation and restoration. Regarding reparation, the abolitionist archive serves as a locus to facilitate radical truth-telling about the damage done by the multi-century impacts of the punishment paradigm, a plea the anti-lynching advocate Ida B. Wells Barnett made in her publication, The Red Record, in which she stated, quote, "The answer always is, tell the world the facts," end quote. This reparatory justice might include more tribunals, truth commissions, or trials, but it also must not cease there and should encompass modes of memorializing in public spaces and educational curricula. Regarding restoration, abolitionist archives learn from the experts in restorative justice and heed their call by, quote, investing in the social service infrastructure that reduces the likelihood of violence in the first place, including schools. In practice, this could entail abolitionist archives advocating for complete divestment from the punishment paradigm of police and prison, and the redirection of those funds in part to the operation of more libraries and archives. The decision to employ more police and correctional officers than librarians and archivists is a political one, but the punishment paradigm paralyzes the thought that this decision might be an immoral one. The introduction to this paper discussed obsolescence and so shall its conclusion. In a rush to remain neutral and removed from struggles for justice, what's most at risk for obsolescence will not be the born digital records maintained by the archive, but the archive itself. To develop values that extend beyond evidential and historical, such as transformational and liberational ones, might well be a requirement for the viability of the archivist's craft. Yet the homogeneity of the profession's demographics suggests that this adaptation is further away than it is close. Perhaps from a misguided mindset that the issues of the punishment paradigm matter only to those communities most directly impacted. In that case, the words of the poet Fred Moten resound. He says, quote, "Coalition isn't something that emerges so that you can come help me, a maneuver that always gets traced back to your own interest. The coalition emerges out of your recognition that it's fucked up for you in the same way that we've already recognized it's fucked up for us. I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too, however much more slowly. You stupid motherfucker." You know? Thank you.
Is there any value, you have some more time if there's something you'd like to actually show that you weren't able to convey?
Yeah, I think it's worth giving voice to some of the survivors and victims of police violence. So I'll play this clip of the mother of Angelo Miller.
Because I have to go to the workforce, I have to deal with the public, I have kids and grandkids. So I have to put on this disguise because when your child is taken away from you, your life will never, ever be the same. That's right. Some things you can't listen to no more, some things you can't watch no more, some things you can't cook no more, some things you can't eat no more. That's how sickening it is. It's a pain that we deal with. We can't explain. You know, you have to be that parent that loses that child. That's it.
And so all of these videos, I didn't talk about this during the text of my talk, are stored on the website that Shruti had mentioned, People's Archive of Police Violence in Cleveland. That's archiveandpoliceviolence.org. And one of the other founders of this archive and we have a peer-reviewed article coming out where we talk more about the genesis of this this project. So I can talk more about this in the Q&A, but right now I'll turn it over to my other panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you.